What is going on, you guys? I want to talk to you today about Legion and some of the rules changes that are coming out regarding cover and the way ranged combat is working. It looks like there are some updates coming to the rules reference guide, and there's some emails floating around from Alex Davey himself to clarify some of these things. So I thought I'd talk to you guys a little bit today about some of those changes and what they're going to mean, and I have kind of a sample range set up right here just to show you a couple of different cases. And basically the first one is melee combat and ranged combat as it applies to the RRG. If units that are in a melee are attacking each other, they do not give suppression. Even though if from a certain look at the rules reference guide, it looks like suppression can be from any attack, but that is going to be changed in the next update to only allow ranged combat to give suppression. So that's how you should basically be playing it now, because that is the intent. It looks like it may have been either just an accidental omission or just not included, but basically the only way you're getting suppression is from ranged attacks or any attack that has the suppressive keyword, or both. So in theory, if a melee attack had the suppressive keyword, you could potentially get one suppression from that, whereas a ranged attack is going to give a suppression token on its own, and as well as a suppressive keywords. But inherently, the only way you get suppression is from a ranged attack naturally. Now let's look at cover and line of sight. First off, there's the 50% of the miniature rule. So I'm going to use this piece of terrain right here to talk about how the 50% rule is supposed to work. One of the things that is supposed to do is to determine if this piece is going to give cover. So what I can do is I can line this right up next to a trooper and say, okay, well that certainly can obscure more than 50% of that miniature, no problem. If I line that up next to an ATRT, okay, no problem. That's easily covering half of that ATRT. No problem. And this, by the way, is just a super modified one. I put all the guns on him. But then if I line this up next to an ATST, well, it's clearly not covering 50% of that miniature. So this would provide no cover to the ATST. That's what the 50% rule is. It's not supposed to be something that you check in-game. There is also, if at least half the unit is behind, then it can apply to them. However, if a piece is going to be too small to provide like a vehicle cover, then, you know, like a barricade isn't going to do anything for an ATST, for example. It's much too small. So that is going away. So basically that's the rule for that. So you're not going to, you know, have to say like, oh, well, am I, you know, far enough behind this one? You're supposed to check those things and determine what cover is going to do beforehand. And that's where the 50% rule comes in. If it can cover half of the miniature when the miniature is pressed up against it, then it can't. Like now this piece, for example, certainly could. This one is much bigger. This one is covering about 50% of that miniature. It's going all the way up there. And then, of course, the other part is covering the whole thing, so that's easily there. And if it's right on the line, you and your opponent have to agree. You can always just roll a die and determine it that way as well. Now, the next part I want to talk about, I moved that a little bit, but the next part I want to talk about is line of sight and cover. For example, elevated units here. You know, we've got this unit here, and you know, there's a shot going on here. These guys are going to get their heavy cover. They're behind this. They're touching it. They can shoot back without it. But what about these guys out in the open, right? Let's say, you know, because if you look at the rules as written, I can go from my unit leader here and measure to this other stormtrooper unit, and you're supposed to draw an imaginary line from base to base. Well, that imaginary line is going through cover, even though the shot appears that it would go over the overhead. Now, part of this, there's a couple of reasons. I think part of it is, you know, in the Learn to Play guide, and what's written is written for a flat scenario. A flat game where you're only using barricades and you're only using really, you know, low, small units. You don't have any ATSTs, you don't have high elevation, you don't have any snow speeders. So in a flat game, you're just going basically base to base for the most part. So you're not going to get into any situations where somebody's like on top of a barricade or something like that in the base Learn to Play game. However, once you get into an advanced game where you're using your own terrain, you're likely to come up with scenarios like this. So one of the things that's going around in Alex's email right now is they're looking at changing the way that line of sight and cover are worded to give more of the intent. And this is something kind of I talked about in a previous video where I talked about line of sight and cover the way it is right now versus maybe the way it should be. So this right here, this is a piece that has both up and, an underneathing arch as well as a, the overhead. And underneathing, I think I just made up a new word, underneathing. So yeah, hashtag underneathing. But these guys are above. Now, first thing you need to consider, if you're going from base to base, that line would cut through this terrain. However, since they're in base contact with that terrain, that's not going to make any difference. So that's important. But the idea is you need to make sure that from the top center of the miniature you can see, because normally there's 3 different things you're using, right? You're making sure you have line of sight that you can see them, and then every unit in there can also see them. But primarily your unit leader has to be able to see them. In addition, every unit that wants to contribute dice also has to be able to see them. So if I've got this one guy, behind a cave, or if there's a wall there, then he's not going to be able to contribute dice. So we need to be able to see them, but also we need to have them in range. So we're going to measure range, obviously. But beyond that, you also need to check for cover. So now, from a common sense standpoint, and from a thematic standpoint, these guys are out in the open, so they shouldn't get cover. Now, if I had guys that were only elevated maybe an inch from really far away, then maybe they would. So one of the things is when you're checking line of sight, that's when they want you to determine if there's cover. So that's what it looks like is going to happen. Is, when I'm saying, okay, boom, I can see 100% of that unit. Well, now there's no reason to check and to do this base to base. So if I can see you from here, well, now we don't have to draw this imaginary line on the ground, and that is going through a barricade out in the middle of nowhere. This won't be a big deal in everybody's games, but this is going to be a bigger deal depending on the type of terrain you're going with. So some people complain and they say, well, if that's the rule, I've seen some people in my comments when I suggested it should just be true line of sight. Well, then a really tall unit like this would have an advantage because of the fact that it will be able to see everybody. And the thing is, that's okay. That's over a 200-point unit. That's the most expensive unit in the game. It should be able to take a shot on you. That's part of what you're paying for, And the thing is, it doesn't, right? Like, these guys right here are in base contact with this barricade. It is still going to give them heavy cover. Because when you look down at them, you can't see part of their feet. So they are getting cover of that. They don't have to be, this is where you say, they don't have to be 50% covered. They just have to be partially obscured. And then you already know that these barricades are 50% of the miniature. So you're okay there. And so all of these kind of factor into each other. So now I'm going to take, the camera off and we're going to do some kind of line of sight looking.
So under the old rules, the ATST wouldn't actually have an unobstructed shot to
these guys up here because of this barricade that's in the way, even though it has nothing to do with their shot, right? And so because that barricade, we already know that gives troopers cover. They'd have heavy cover from a shot from an ATST, which is really unfortunate. But when you get behind and you go to measure, you realize, I can see that unit. If you go from top center, I can see all of that unit, and there's nothing that's obscuring them. So I don't have to go ahead and, draw that line and figure out what kind of cover they're getting. Now, same thing goes for this unit that's out in the middle of nowhere. This unit obviously is unprotected. They have no cover. But look, there's that barricade in the middle of nowhere. So in this case, when we're seeing, do I have line of sight on them? I do. I have full line of sight on them. I don't have to even bother checking for cover. Now look at this unit. This unit is behind a barricade, and they are using the barricade, specifically. So now when I go ahead and I check, and I look, you know what? Let's take a closer look at that. Those guys are partially obscured. Granted, yeah, I can maybe see that guy behind. I can see that other guy behind, but the unit itself does have some obscured, or does have partial obscurity. So because of that, now that unit gets heavy cover. Now I go ahead and I draw my line from base to base and do all that. Yes, it's going through that. So in this way we determine which piece it's going through. And it's going through that barricade. The barricade is, we've determined beforehand, and I'm going by the numbers here. We all know barricades give troopers heavy cover. And that's the case. Now, type of cover is going to depend on different terrains. So let's talk about that. So barricades are made of steel in this game. That's, thematically they're made of steel, so they're there to give you heavy cover. But there's going to be other things that don't necessarily provide as much protection. Trees, for example, are the ideal sort of light cover terrain piece. That's something that can give you light cover. Anything, and this is something you need to determine beforehand. Things that are thinner or less durable should generally provide lighter cover. I have some scraps that I have used that basically kind of fell off of when I was making my Hoth terrain, and they have flat bottoms, and those are meant to be just light snow drifts. And I have used stuff like this as also light cover in that it's just snow. This might be a bad example in here because with this new rules clarification, actually it doesn't even cover 50% of the mini. So what I would need to do in this case is just get a different kind of piece, and then we would determine whether or not it's ice or snow. So the new rules, this one that I used to use, is actually not going to provide any cover at all, unless maybe I get like a rat or a loth cat. But then there's mixed pieces, and this is where you can get into the really fun stuff. All right, so I'm going to use this from the Disney store. We got this Kylo Ren tie. So let's say we're doing Starkiller base, which is appropriate since I've got trees here. Well, one of the things we can do is we can say that all of this part of the tie provides heavy cover because the bulk of the machine is right here. But the front parts where the panels stick out, we could say that from here on out, it only provides light cover. And this is stuff that you talk about with your friends or your opponent before you play the game. Complicated pieces like this are probably best not used in tournament games unless the TO is going to tell you exactly what everything does, just because it's a little bit ambiguous. Because if you're firing potentially right across the front where you have those, but a part of it cuts into the cockpit, you might well is the cockpit heavy cover or light cover? We didn't talk about that beforehand. And then before you ask, this laser I'm using is an Army Painter target lock, just laser. I got this from Sci-Fi City in Orlando, but they sell these type of things just about anywhere. They sell mini wargaming stuff, paints, and 40K type stuff like that. So, but yeah, it takes regular batteries, and I've been using this thing for a long time. It's really, really helpful in X-Wing, Armada, just about any tabletop game, stuff like this is really good for. But so basically you're going to talk about all the terrain and what it does beforehand, but that's where the 50% rule comes in. These trees obviously are going to provide light cover, but they're going to definitely cover it. These trees, for example, would also provide the ATST with light cover because they do cover up more than 50% of the miniature. And that's one of the things that we're looking at is how much of the miniature does it cover? Now I want to use another example. Since I put these trees out, we're actually going to go over and say that I'm going to shoot these open stormtroopers here. And the barricade normally, so if the barricade was in the way, this new method is going to have them shooting over the barricade and it won't matter. But now let's say the trees are in the way. And now when we're determining line of sight, well, I can't see that whole unit because they're behind some of those trees. And they are going to get light cover because we would determine that the trees that give light cover, and because the unit is behind it, then they're going to get that light cover. And that's all it really takes. That's what it boils down to. So that's what, and this isn't 100% official yet because this is just stuff in emails, but that does give you the idea of where they're going. So I think that's important to talk about. One of the things that remain to be 100% clarified right now, though, is flying vehicles, because if let's say this, how do you determine what covers a flying vehicle? Because let's say this guy is right here, and this is this covers half of that, but it's not covering any of the mini. So I think in those cases, this is just me doing a judgment call here. You'd have to figure out what covers half of that mini, and I think in this case, this guy could potentially cover half of the mini. If we want to go up and kind of size it up just like that, I think he does. He gets more than halfway high. So if you got into a situation where there was a barricade on top of a piece of terrain and somebody was shooting at it from down here, then I think it would get that heavy cover from that barricade. But those are really rare circumstances because this thing is up high. I don't think you should really use the peg, because if, let's say, it's like that, and these troopers are shooting at it, that barricade shouldn't do anything. So those pegs should really be ignored when you're talking about flying vehicles like that, because that just wouldn't make sense otherwise. But we're gonna have to wait and see what the ruling is on that. But I am gonna go ahead and say probably ignore the pegs, for now, because those pegs are clear. You can see right through them. I think that's I think that's kind of, no small thing. The only time I wouldn't say ignore a peg is if somebody's maybe modified their ATST, and they have it in a walking position and they use like a clear peg to hold the foot up or something like that. Well, that one, you're not really counting that as a clear peg. You're just there. That's just for stability. But these guys have a clear peg because they're flying, and so obviously something that's flying over top of a barricade shouldn't get protection from that barricade unless that's actually in the path of the miniature itself. So that's what I have to say about that. There is another round of the giveaway going on right now. Still a few more days left to enter. So I do want to just remind you guys, there is still time. All you need to do is to be a subscriber and leave a comment on this or one of my other videos. It's as simple as that, guys. So you can win an expansion of your choice in the form of a $20 Cool Stuff gift card. So thank you guys so much for watching. I do tend to announce winners towards the end of the video, so you kind of have to watch the whole thing. But that's about it, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Let me know what you think about these rulings. I'm eager for a new rules reference guide to come out and solidify all of this stuff. And once that happens, I will probably be doing my full learn to play video because there's so many rules that are kind of up in limbo right now. I am just holding off a little bit because I don't want to do a learn to play video and then the very next week, the rules totally change and now my learn to play video is totally wrong. So that's kind of one of the things that I've been holding off on. So if you're waiting for a tutorial for this game on me, you'll have to wait just a little bit longer, but I promise you it is coming. So thank you guys so much for watching and have a great day.